Hi everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Well, today we're going to look at the inferiority complex. And one thing to understand, of course, as you guys will all know about this, is that it's not a one-sided aspect of human development and adaptation. There is, according to Jung anyway, no inferiority without a hidden compensating superiority. And both sides can change into one another. So, in other words, if somebody truly is inferior, they tend to overcompensate for that and act in a superior, exaggerated, inflationary sort of way. And for Jung, the opposite is true. That if somebody has a great deal of potential for life, there's a tendency for them to learn by experience that the world doesn't want to receive that from them. And so they overcompensate by adopting what would normally be called an inferior or subdominant status within a family, a group, and so forth. So in both cases, on the surface, the person who has the inferiority complex and overcompensates tends to look dominant. So a superficial understanding of somebody like that would think that they were very confident, very in charge of their life, and that the reverse, as I say, from a pure Jungian perspective, would be that someone who has a great deal of superiority, if you like, in terms of their ability and potential, may have received such negative reinforcement for that, starting within the family, then perhaps extended peer groups, school, and so forth, that they will dumb themselves down and, as Caesar Mladen might say, occupy a position in the middle of the pack or at the back. But really, their potential is very, very high. The problem in both cases, of course, is that overcompensated inferiority that appears to be superiority tends to get reinforced. So the culture supports people who are inflated, narcissistic, aggressive, fake, in terms of their relationships. And it punishes people who don't actualize their potential, albeit that all of that is on the surface. And albeit too, that the genome does understand the difference between the two. The difference is recorded and it's represented within meta-instinctive scenarios. But those meta-instinctive scenarios are not actualized in the world by the individual personality and character of a specific person. So things get skewed the other way. And the reason that that's supported is that if we, for example, give up on our positive potential, then we are so suboptimal, we're not making much of a contribution via society or culture towards the gene pool. So homeostasis reacts by saying, if you won't assert your positive potential, then you deserve to have your status lowered. And also, because of that crucial adaptive need with respect to the genome to adapt to the world, bring in good things, improve culture, society, and so forth, because you're not fulfilling that, you then will suffer from a neurosis, which will either cure you, as Jung understood that process to be, by putting you under such pressure that you change, or, as I say, we default then, that's the way the genome does, back down to Darwin, shut off Plato, so the individuation process can't come through, and then you get punished and deleted out of the gene pool. Because at that point, Darwin is the executor of the process. Natural selection says if you will not actualize your potential, then you'll be very uncomfortable, neurotic, and you'll drop out of the gene pool. This explains at an evolutionary level why narcissism is rewarded, why psychopathy is rewarded, sociopathy, and so forth. All of the dark triad and the extended field of such people, why those adaptations are held to succeed, even though they are negative in every moral sense. So that's the first thing we need to appreciate as clinicians, that when we meet people who appear to be very withdrawn and collapsed into themselves, but are suffering from their potential, in essence, there is a superiority complex that is functional at the level of ego identification and of engagement with the world. However, of course, if we start to make judgments like that and point that out directly, then we become abusers. We become part of the field of the problem. And how that happens is that the complex which split off early in life, we can say as an example, for an individual, when they couldn't optimize their potential because their siblings, their parents, their school, wherever it was, could not accept or nurture their development, the complex would split off to protect them. After a while, as you know, that this process, which starts as Jungian, becomes autonomous in a Jungian sense. It acquires its own Darwinian selective pressures. It caps and misdirects instincts, and it essentially sits there in the self-concept and says, I will protect you as I've always protected you, therefore stay as you are and you can't be hurt. That isn't the truth, of course, but that's what happens when people divide under Jungian pressure. So moving forward then, the alternative extreme, because we're talking about Jungian ideas principally here, and Jung does work in terms of opposites that are extreme enough to appear to be opposite to one another, then the person who has a huge sense of inferiority will develop either because their character is orientated that way, or they will acquire a protective complex that makes them function in both cases as if they were a narcissist or a psychopath or a sociopath. And you can then see the immediate problem, I'm sure, as to how do you tell with an individual whether their, say, narcissism is a developmental reaction due to a complex based on unfortunate life experiences, or regardless of life experiences in the extreme, their character was inclined that way. And no amount of supportive change would have changed them. They would always be that way because that's the basic nature that they have. And it's extremely difficult to know because a malignant narcissist is so manipulative and so highly motivated that they absorb just about anything in terms of information they can receive from their environment to control that environment towards meeting their own needs. The neurotic, I'll call them that, developmental narcissist functions in pretty much the same way, but there's always a real, genuine ray of light and hope within them that you can reach that is just not there with a true genetic malignant narcissist. But they are very clever at hiding that, reading you, interpreting your understanding of things, and feeding that back. So the dark triad stuff and inferiority-superiority are linked. The family complex, too, is linked because that's the initial containing and developing vessel within which we all pass through. And so in the case of a malignant narcissist, dark triad types, then all that will happen is that they are nurtured to become that, and they acquire more and more capacity to control others. Whereas the neurotic developmental protective response, which appears to be narcissism, as I say, there is something in there, it's palpable and you can reach it. Now, in the case of the person that I've just described that you can reach, Alfred Adler's psychology, his approach is entirely appropriate. In the case of the former, then the appropriate level of understanding is not Adlerian, it's Freudian, because it's all about gratification, personal gratification, hostility, aggression, manipulation, that kind of thing. But there's also the Jungian level, as we model these three as working together, that both will have elements of fantasy, inflated, unreal fantasy. In the case of the person who's been conditioned by their environment to develop protective narcissistic traits, that will just be a collapse and a withdrawal into a safe space that they create through their fantasy, which may mean that they get accused of being schizoid, that's to say, withdrawing from the real world and only communicating through fantasy. Some of them may even have low grade, I'll call it autistic spectrum disorder traits as well, and then get diagnosed for that. But it's not real. It's a dynamical process which appears to be that way. But with the dark triad narcissist, then their inflation is classic Jungian in the negative sense. Their Freud is driving them. They acquire the Adler, the power, in order to manipulate others, and then the aggrandizement upscales dramatically to the level where you see people like podcast and internet gurus basically losing it with their inflation, and a lot of them do get attracted to Jung these days because it's such a fertile domain within which to manipulate other people whilst placing themselves at the focus of that field. You know, they are the guardians. They are the ones who understand. Nobody else does. They can interpret Jung like no one else ever before, not even Jung himself. So when you see traits like that emerging in an individual with the level of Jungian inflation is like that, and there is no correction for it, then that's a very strong indication that you have a problem of character. Whereas the person who withdraws into fantasy and prefers that to engaging with life, we can safely say they're not at the Jungian level yet. Their fantasies are more of a projection, a future projection. And Jung himself picked up on this, of an anticipated goal, if only they could move towards it, if only they could really actualize all of this. But because their inferior behavior is capping their potential, their superiority, they remain divided. And that's where all of the tension of the neurosis is for such people. And I think it's fair to say in both of our experience, there's the amount of rapport, empathy, sympathy, whatever you want to call it, for such people is, or you feel it very, very high because of the track that they are in. Whereas with the other types, then over time, there is no change and there is only malignancy and control of other people. And there's probably nothing that can be done with them because you're asking them to change their genome, which is not an easy thing to do in terms of gene expression and lifespan development. Now, there is a grey zone in between where there are elements of both. So in that regard, then you would get people who are not 100% malignant, narcissist or dark triad people, but there's some elements of that that's not fully expressed. But there's also the reaction to that in them, which produces a defensive complex, which is genuine when it first forms and then becomes part of the individuation neurosis for that person. And of course, then what you're obliged to do, if you're a therapist, is do everything you can to help that person. So eventually, who they really are will emerge, and hopefully, it's going to be somebody who is good for themselves and good for the world. But where that's not there, then it's a lengthy process whereby you become hooked in by your own good nature, goodwill, your character and calling as a therapist to reach into somebody's nature and find, is there some light inside this otherwise dark soul? And as I say, that is a dangerous position because they are utterly cold and ruthless about their Freudian level of development. Everybody and everything has to be drawn into relationship to that. So we could say that that's a broad spectrum, classic psychodynamic understanding of how these things manifest. But there are other ways of looking at it, and they, of course, have to do with evolution, with the strength of these particular traits that might appear in someone. And that can involve us going into the archaic ancestral psyche. And as we know, there's a Freudian perspective on that, which picks up generally on the negative. There's a Jungian perspective on that, which generally picks up on the positive. And then there's an adaptive level, which has been highly conserved since the Palaeolithic, which is psychosocial, and that is Adler's domain. So working through those with someone who's suffering in that way is a difficult process. But The people who are simply neurotic in an ordinary sense, that they've divided protectively, a complex split off from them, fixed itself at the time when it formed, referred everything to that time and to that core, modifies itself only insofar as it needs to keep that division going. That is something that you can access using all of the dissociative methods that we routinely use. But the interesting thing, of course, is that that kind of neurotic pathology operates in every domain within the field of the biopsychosocial stack. You'll see it in the family. You'll see it in work relationships. You'll see it in lifespan development, adaptation to partners, siblings, and so forth. And then that complex will acquire a Freudian element too, because Freud seeks Adler. So even if the person's developed as an Adlerian adaptation and has an issue with inferiority-superiority, Freud will say, because it's pushing from the instincts, particularly Panksepian ones, in a very basic elementary way, I have to survive, the genome does. We have to leverage the complex to meet our basic needs. How do we do that? Well, we can't do it through primary gain because the person's not accessing themselves in the world. So, or other people in the world accessing resources. So we'll do it through secondary gain. And that's another thing that Freud saw in a pathological sense, that when he said, for example, all symptoms are aimed at someone, then in the family or in a mature adult relationship, you will see that. You'll see, for example, as Freud did, agoraphobia in a woman in his day could be aimed at the husband because it reduces the husband's life in the world and his adaptation and draws libido and energy from him to her. And Freud famously said at one point, of course, I'm pretty sure you're aware of this, the reason you have agoraphobia, he said to a woman, is because if you leave the house, then every man you meet will be more attractive than your husband. And you can't face that. You can't face basically the id, the desire for instinctive gratification. There's a truth to that in such cases. And we have worked with people in the contemporary world, not just in Vienna. Well, we weren't there in Vienna, but not just in that context, but a contemporary context where that is true at one level. At the manifest level, it can be interpreted and it can be imposed that way. But suppose if we're thinking still psychodynamically, we say, well, what would positive Jung say about a fixation at that level and in that way? And he would be looking for the compensations that would appear on the surface to be one thing, but were really another. Yes, there's the secondary gain. Yes, there is the collapse. But what else is trying to get through? And he would work on that. And unfortunately, he would work on constructs like the shadow, the animus, if it was a woman, and the rest of it. And that will take a long time. Whereas if we are to appeal directly to homeostasis, you know where I'm going with this, by using dissociative methods, which uncouples the ego from its identified with complexes, then we free up the genome to release the meta instincts that are necessary to configure as a projection into the future and pull the person towards that. And that's teleology, which Adler believed in. He believed in teleology. He believed in that ultimate goal and directedness of development. But it's also Jungian in the sense that the goal is not then just merely social interest, helping other people in an Adlerian sense. For Jung, it's individuation, which for him can go as far as the spiritual and the transpersonal. But what about Freud? If there was a positive angle on Freud to take in this, that would be the release of the genome. It would be the proper release of instincts that would bring about all of the adaptation necessary to move into Adler and correct for everything that's gone wrong there, and ultimately to arrive at Jung and correct everything that's gone wrong there by positive Freud and positive Adler. The problem historically, of course, was that all three of them fell out and didn't get on and tried to distort one another's theories and practices in that typical Darwinian way. But if we suspend their disputes between themselves and receive people as they are, we can then see that all three are present, but there is a progression. The Freudian pathology starts first. Adlerian pathology starts second. The Jungian pathology starts third, even if someone is very young, so to speak, in terms of development. So an early sense of inflation, aggrandizement, attachment to fantasy, that kind of thing can appear very early on in child development. And what they're doing is, if you like, is that the Jungian level is in service of the frustrated arblet, social adaptation. It conceals it, it converts it, and it's also doing exactly the same for Freud. As far as homeostasis is concerned, this is not that important when you're a child, but when you hit puberty, then it's suddenly very important that we start to relate in a social and biological way. And it's then the problems start. We all know this from our own life experience and the people that we know. And Freud himself called it like a latency period at the end of the Oedipal crisis. There's a latency period, and then suddenly you hit puberty and everything kicks off again. Well, in that latency period, you can get Adler and Jung in terms of the genome and its meta instincts generating fantasies as anticipations of the future. That's one way for a child to escape the demands of biology. So you can get, sadly, in some women, for example, where they reject puberty, you get bulimia, anorexia nervosa, other kinds of eating disorders, which originated with Freud, then it becomes psychosocial, and then it becomes elevated within themselves into a higher controlling authority. But the one thing that organizes Freud, Adler, and Jung as we move through life is a complex which will sit at the core of our self-concept and basically regulates an individuation neurosis, a split and a division. That is a very complicated field to attempt to understand. So how do we do that? Well, I would say we need to have a minimal understanding of the theory behind everything and of the figures who've developed their understanding. Minimal, not too much. If we acquire too much of it in a practical sense, it gets in the way. So that progression, that understanding of Freud, Adler, and Jung, the role of biology, social adaptation, and then the drive to individuate, which is simultaneously biological, social, and Jungian in a spiritual sense. If we understand that, we have that as the outer rim of a containing field through which we can operate. And our approach must be then, how do these complexes form? What goes wrong in developments for people? And it's always a dissociative state or event or series of them that involves Jungian partitioning of the self-concept, the ego basically, and of the self-image, and complexes optimizing themselves through being split off, becoming autonomous, identified with, and so forth. So we can say then that these particular complexes become kinds of other ego, not completely, not in a complete sense, but they are sufficiently powerful that they can control the ego and that they are resistant to change. That is the neurosis. That's the conflict that we have to deal with in people. So if we get a presenting case, what do we do? Well, we have to assess them in terms of their lifespan development, see where Freud, Adler, and Jung are working, assess what kind of complex is operating. Relatively easy to do. It's not just the symptoms, the manifest symptoms, it's also what's controlling the expression of those symptoms. And then utilizing dissociative methods that access what the Jungians would think of as the self-archetype, whilst at the same time saying you can't do it. You can't do it that way. It's too quick. It takes years. No, it doesn't. It's always there. And it's accessible. And all it really is the projection into psychology as an image of the genome's understanding of itself and its own unfolding lifespan development. And the genome, of course, is not only the molecules of the DNA, it's also all of its associated fields, including the platonic. So when we access the genome, now we're accessing a heterogeneous, a mixed field of states, which include the pure molecular state of DNA, but everything that they work with, understand, and anticipate. That seems again like a lot, but it's not. And this is where the representations of the genome, as projected forward into psychology, that become images, are useful, because the image then becomes the portal to going beyond the image. And that can be done through dissociative methods. So that's a broad outline. Appreciate it's complicated, but there is a hidden simplicity within this. Would anybody like to, what would you like to, Pauline?
I don't mind. I mean, there's so much in that, as always, that I could comment on. I think one of the things that impacted me the most was when you were describing Freud's approach, because there's something in the directness of his approach, albeit a more negative appraisal of things, that I think is very useful. It actually made me think of the idea of a Zen koan. That directness of actually cutting through, I won't say the word, but cutting through the complex, essentially, is it pulls the ego up sharp. I mean, you can imagine in some circumstances what that would be like. The example you gave of agoraphobia, to actually directly say that to someone, which is quite a brutal thing to do, but it's so incisive in terms of an insight that I think sometimes for some people in some contexts, it can actually shock them so much that it forces a change, it forces a compensation, and a lot of good can come from that. But I don't think it's always, the value of that is always seen sufficiently. I mean, Milton Erickson was the same within his own domain, in so much as he would be very forthright at times about certain things, even down to picking up on an aspect of somebody's appearance, which I'm not saying is necessarily a good thing or the right thing to do. But again, it was a way of getting people to see things from another perspective.
Yeah.
And I think there is some value in that.
Yeah.
And as I say, the directness of Freud's approach, the incisiveness of it, can be very, very effective at times, because you could, obviously, we all know, don't we? Everyone's so familiar with Jung by now, that they know how easy it is to get lost in the woolliness of Jungian theory if you're not careful. But that I think is valuable. I think the other thing that occurred to me too, and this is based, I suppose, on empirical observation, I would imagine that you would concur with this, Steve, that you tend not to see the coupling of character disorders with the superiority complex as much as you do the opposite way round. Which I think is interesting.
Yeah, that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that and Darwin is cruel. I mean that metaphorically, of course. That what Darwin represents and taught, that factor is cruel. And if we act in a subdominant way and are not making a contribution, then he's likely to get his razor out, and people
we get punished for it.
They certainly they get punished for it. Whereas psychopathy in its various forms can be rewarded.
And often is.
And often is. Even though some of those people are seriously deranged. Quite apart from being morally questionable and all the rest of it. But people with a superiority complex make you work really hard.
Oh, they do.
They're like vampires, you see. They actually pull your energy out. So it's disappearing into something. And they're using your attention as confirmation for remaining in the state. They're not actually listening to you. This is, if you have a normal sort of cognitive level interaction with people like that, then it's stand hard work, and a CBT approach will locate the problem very quickly in the person, because it's economical on their energy to not go along with with this lengthy engagement. And I understand that at one level, but there's also the analytical approach, which takes forever. And it pulls all of these resistances into the model of transference. And then they use transference as a justification for extended therapy. And then they add the fantasies to that, which come from dream analysis. So it goes on forever. It doesn't need to be either of those extremes. What's missing in both cases is that they generally have either failed to learn or forgotten the history of both of those disciplines. That hypnosis was connected very closely to the beginning of behavior therapy and psychoanalysis. In fact, it was there before psychoanalysis. And using altered states, naturally, as Charcot understood, although he didn't quite get it 100% right, but he was on the track. He understood that the split or the division that was producing neurotic symptoms came about through a dissociation. And they used to, as you probably know, put on performances with patients at Salpêtrière Medical School in Paris, where you would induce hysteria and then remove it to say it's all down to that, But he then said only hysterical people can be hypnotized. From an authoritarian perspective, that's still believed. So that means that there is no utilization of natural states. There is only the imposition of states through an authoritarian and direct method that has severe limitations. Systematic desensitization, if you're familiar with that as a behavior modification technique, started out with Joseph Wolfe as a hypnotic technique. But he was authoritarian and direct, like Freud was, like most of them were, like Jung was. And he came up against the limits of the way that he was approaching people, so he dropped hypnosis thinking that was the problem. In the same way that Freud dropped it and Jung, because he thought, well, they both thought transference was the problem. That's because they were ordering people about. Of course, that then turns you into a parent. That then constellates the field of all of the neurotic adaptations and maladaptations to parents, but also the meta-instinctive anticipation that this parent, this therapist, this analyst might be a better one than the one that I've had. And there's a closer correlation with the meta-instinctive and genomic understanding of what a good parent should be. And then suddenly you've got a positive transference, which is actually a negative form of attachment that appears to be positive, but it's still making demands. And transference is a very unpleasant thing. And what Freud did is he put his tin hat on and dived into the trench and fought trench warfare with transference, and it took years. Jung did the same thing, and then later he tried to convert it by bringing in, and this was, I'll give him this due, it was an intelligent thing to do, was to find a means by which to convert transference into something else that would incline a person towards his interests. Hence, it would be alchemy and Gnosticism, all of the mystery traditions, symbolism, mythology. That generates a third party to the therapy, which is collective. And then he could call it the collective unconscious. So it shifts things off him and puts it into a different register. That also slows things down. But this idea of saying what caused a neurosis, à la Janet, that is dissociation and partitioning. And if it's caused it, we can put it back together again by reversing the process. A new kind of dissociation. And Milton Erickson, at his best, was someone who used suggestions that were based on metaphor that themselves suggested the kinds of things that the Jungians were trying to work with, but in a naturalistic way that would be met from the inside by meta-instincts. The meta-instincts would receive the metaphor and bind with it and make internal sense without the superficial distractions that come with the Jungians into myths and fairy tales. And with the latter, of course, as you guys know, complexes love that, because the minute you start to talk about opposites, they'll say, okay, I'll generate another one. And then the well-meaning Jungian will say, well, that's the Hegelian dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, another thesis. In other words, another complex or another aspect of the complex. And they go on like that in this hyper-rational way. Or they disappear into mysticism by that lateral distribution of generating more and more impressions of the same thing. Complex will love that because it's being fed. So the way around that is to go into a state where the ego is uncoupled from its complexes and the negative part of its self-image and self-concept, and experiences correction in a healing, transformative way that comes from the inside. And that is the way to deal with an inferiority and superiority complex that is faster even than focusing only on social interests, as Adler does. The solution will include Adler, but it doesn't go on that zigzag path that Adler outlined. It also satisfies Freud and it satisfies Jung. So the clinical issue then is to establish what you're up against and understand that they're both potentially very, very difficult. The dark triad personality is malignant in intent at every level and is not interested in anything but themselves. The neurotic person who's suffering from that kind of inferiority-superiority parallel will attempt to draw you into confirming them for being that way and will pull more and more and more of your energy out. You can see it on their face. You can hear it in their words. You can see it in their eyes. They boot up the complex to filter and distort anything that's positive and suggest in any ordinary way that they can turn their positive potential into lived experience. So the approach then will be dissociative. There are different ways of doing that. You know in broad terms about how hypnosis handles that, but you've also got the creative therapies as well, because that moves the complex into different kinds of representational states. You combine that with basic hypnosis and then gradually more advanced hypnosis, right up to the level of enactments, and you can solve it if you need to go that far. But even if you do, it doesn't mean that it needs to take a long time. And this will make you very unpopular with your professional colleagues because you'll be getting results that they can't get. Because way upstream of them delivering anything are all the constellated remnants of failures of theory and practice that are in the culture and are superpositioned with the present. So they kind of download the failings and they don't download the success. So there's an awful lot there. I appreciate that. But if we're thinking in realistic terms about being practical, they are the things that everybody needs to understand. Because if not, there are traps waiting. And fantasy is one of them. Fantasy based on a theory and then reference to that theory. So the person we're working with is referred to it, becomes involved in it, and the complex jumps in as well and says, this is great. This is a sandbox. I can have huge fun here. I can generate all these inner figures, which are just representations of me acting, playing around. I can be Gandalf. How about that? Or, some other figure from science fiction or mythology, and then I can persuade the ego, you identify with what I'm suggesting to you. And then the ego will go like that, but at the same time retreat. Expand and retreat, become schizoid, failing to adapt. The therapist tries to chase the receding ego and walks into the fantasies that he or she have fired ahead of that retreating ego. And then finds the things that he or she is looking for. Oh yeah, there's the shadow. There's the anima, there's the animus. Why? Well, because we've told the person that these things exist and the complex has agreed and pulled you in. And there's no progress. So they are fundamental considerations. Your delivery must be honest from the heart. It must be interested in rapport, interested in the other person. And then you'll see the complex begin to weaken almost straight away. But it will try and fight back. That's okay. You've anticipated that, you understand that, and you're ready to receive what it will do. and then keep reaching in deeply into the person and the field of their whole being. And then you can see them start to reconfigure until the complex realizes that it can't sustain itself any further in an identifiable state and will be pushed back into consolidation. So it'll be not forgotten that these things ever happen, but it won't have any effect. No effect in the future, and no interpretation and misdirection when the ego looks into the past. It's not there anymore. It's not identified with. So to say that's the essential ground from which to start a clean therapeutic approach. Mladen, you got your hand up.
Thank you, Steve. That was wonderful. The entire line of your explication was very easy to follow through and deliberately well put. So thank you on that. While you were explaining superiority and inferiority, something came to mind, and if I'm correct, that saying that it was Jung who thought that both are the same thing when viewed from a specific angle, and that's where my question is, and presumably also the answer is there. But if we imagine a situation where someone has a superiority complex, let's say through development and parental relations or in the peer group, and then they identify with being inferior, basically because of the effects of the social circle, and then could we see like spiraling in the situation spiraling in other direction, where now the overcompensation is again in the form of superiority, and we get back and forth chasing it. So is that also a possible scenario?
Absolutely, 100%. Very well said.
All right, thank you.
And there are analogues here, for example, with Freud and the Oedipus complex, and Jung introduced the idea of the Electra complex, and Freud said it's the same thing. He said to Jung, you've just invented something to accommodate the female side of the equation. And of course, Jung thought, no, they've got different names for different reasons. And Freud said it's the same thing deep down. We would say, for example, where there's a separation on the surface, the deep structure unites the separation. But I think that Jung was right about that, and that Freud was being far too dogmatic about his collapse. But from within his own model, he was saying it's the same thing. And Adler focused very much on feelings of inferiority, and then the compensation was striving for superiority. And you see the striving for superiority in people who have an inferiority complex in the classic sense. And that is the overcompensation that Jung picked up on. So they argued between themselves about definitions and about what they were focusing on, but there is a level at which things become complementary and part of a field in the way that you have described. And absolutely, yes, in a clinical setting, and even in personal development, as we move through our lifespan development stages of life, we'll have victories and defeats, and we'll attach to one or the other. And then we'll find the compensating fantasies emerging. And in a normal regulatory way, that's okay because they relieve pressure for a while. But if it goes too far, then we only have what Jung called a provisional life. There's no external adaptation. And another one of his solutions to things, which I think was good, was an understanding that for him, you have to deal with Freud first, you have to deal with Adler first, before you can authentically go to his work. Because otherwise you'd have to include the entirety of Freud and the entirety of Adler in his work, and he doesn't. He gives them fairly superficial and quite collapsed considerations. With Adler, it's almost like he's the other one. He actually says the other point of view in his collected works. He was measuring himself against Freud. Adler was the other one. Freud said Jung's defection was regressible, but Adler he didn't care about. And so you can see basic psychodynamics moving between the three of them. But what they were looking at is real. It's distorted through their personalities and their interactions, but the fundamentals are real. And that was our approach, which was born out of frustration back in the 1980s, that we were applying things that were not working. They were agreeable to us, but they weren't working with real people. And that's because we were being too classically Jungian in orientation. I mean, we did help some people, but there were a classification or a group of people who were really, really deeply suffering in so many simultaneous states. Jung couldn't get anywhere near them. And this was regardless of how old they were. Would you say, Paul?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I think there's a tendency sometimes for people who are lacking in experience, or they lack authenticity with respect to their expressed concern for other people, to simply take a trip on Jung's ideas.
Yeah.
And taking a trip on Jung's ideas doesn't help anyone. It may well gratify you, the person who is having the trip, but it doesn't deal with the kind of complexity that you're referring to. And we can say that because we've been there and we've done it. For us, it's empirical. We know to try and to go that route with ordinary everyday people who have got complex problems and needs. It doesn't take in the form in which it is generally delivered to people. So even when we did use it, we had to modify it.
We did, yeah.
And I don't, in a way, now looking back all these years, I can't help but feel that Freud and Adler have been much maligned. I mean, they are historical characters. They've made their contribution. I think in many ways they've made great contributions, every bit as great and as extensive and as big as Jung's in many ways, just different. And the idea of we see this a lot, unfortunately, with young people at the moment who are into Jung. They really don't want to go near Freud and Adler. Well, that in and of itself probably tells you something about the state that they're in. But there is so much value to be had in Freud and Adler. There's so much to learn from it, and why someone would want to skip Freud and Adler. Well, it's not beyond me, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's preferable to go through that process, because at least then by the time you get to Jung, you're ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah. 100% agree on that. Yeah, there's an antithesis, because Jung is naturally inflationary if you just learn it from books.
Yeah.
If you live the life authentically, then you find the problems with it, and they don't put you off. It's like, I need to know more. I need to know why this isn't working.
Yeah.
As you guys know, for us, Jung's theory of complexes withstood everything that was thrown at it, and still does. That is robust.
Yes, it is.
Some of his other ideas too are, in terms of lifespan development, that you are capable of change for the whole of your life, and there is an anticipation that you will do that, and there is pressure to do that. But once he put that into his archetypal fantasies, that distanced people from being able to access things which change them enough in the right way. So when we, under pressure of meeting, in my case, it was Freudian material in frontline healthcare, it was like, wow, bloody hell, where am I? I mean, am I in Vienna in 1895? What's wrong here? Why has everything got a Freudian element, and deliberately not, looking down?
You didn't go looking for it.
I didn't go looking at it, like everybody else was looking down on Freud. This is real. But what's missing from Freud also appeared, and that was complexes.
Yeah.
And then it was, whoa, this is the bridge to the body. And the means to reach the body is hypnosis. Because hysteria is that transduction, is the transmutation of the mind into representation within the body. And then they split off and they don't communicate. And these experiences were fundamental. But there were people who had spiritual problems in the background of everything else, and they did need to be reached in a Jungian way. But it was like Jung himself said, sort the other things out and then get to that. And it suddenly became really empirical and validated in that way. So that's why we've developed what we have. That's our empiricism. Everyone is free to test out their own, of course. But the living laboratory is not us, ourselves. It's other people who don't have our preoccupations with the self archetype and the anima or whatever, don't even know what they are and wouldn't mean anything if you said it. And if you did, they might think you've gone loopy.
Well, yeah. Most people just want to leave feeling better. Let's be honest, don't they? They don't really want to be sold all of that.
And that is entirely possible.
It is, yes. Yeah.
It is entirely possible. And you can work with things that Jungians interpret in their way. You work with them in a naturalistic way. You guys, when you went through so far the 3 seminars that we've done on the enactment process, that is Jung condensed but not collapsed. It actually opens out and it does all of the Jungian stuff very, very quickly and in a transformative way with next to no theory, very, very little. But you're working with it in a naturalistic way. That brings about healing, and it's extremely powerful when that happens. But you can get that with sandtrays, you can get it with music, get it with photo imagery, get it with dialectical imagery. All of these things overlap and communicate because they have that one thing in common: altered states of consciousness. And if you prepare your approach, people receive it with you. They don't resist. They receive it.
And representation, of course.
Yeah.
Because that's key as well, isn't it? It's, I think, like you say, with respect to the enactments, anyway, it's as if you're using, you're drawing on the same kinds of representations, say, that Jung would have drawn on, but you lose the dogma.
Yeah.
And so that's the point, isn't it? Once that's moved out of the way, and people just heal naturally from within and very quickly. And we know that the enactment process is very fast. I mean, all of the ones that we've done, they have never gone on for more than an afternoon or a full day.
No.
There may have been a little bit of tidying up afterwards, but the healing would be done within that time frame.
Yeah. There's never been a need to repeat
There's never been a need to repeat it ever.
We've never had to repeat it.
No.
So once a person's been incrementally guided to the point where they need that to finish it off, and this can be in a few weeks or a couple of months maximum, then the job is done.
Yeah.
If you build up the rapport, then you go on that journey together. The Jungians talk about doing that, but it's like it takes 10 years. What? Yeah. Nobody should commit that amount of time to a dependency on a cult, which is what it is.
Yeah.
By other definitions outside of itself, it becomes a cult of personality, which is then embodied by the analyst. The analyst, this is like the dark side of Tantrism, and it does exist, where the guru is the representation of all of the other gurus, the lineage, to the point where they adopt that and live and believe in it regardless of the individuals in front of them. There are ways of doing that differently, where you can draw down a lineage from a field in a Sheldrakean sense that doesn't involve your ego becoming responsible for that to the point where you inflate, but you then become appropriated to the healing field. So it's the opposite of inflation, not deflation, but in the sense of you are now a field participant. And that's a very different perspective to take. But the Jungian analyst and the corrupted Tibetan guru have a lot in common with one another. And that's something that Jungians don't like to look at, because it's the shadow within their own dogma of what it is that they're doing. So,
well, that's typical of dogma, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because very often dogma uses its own dogma back on itself.
Yes.
Or if it were to, it would see very often it was doing the very things that it purports not to do, or accuses other people of doing. But that's the one place really you should go and look.
Yeah. So there's a lot you can do with inferiority, superiority issues in people, and there's usually some elements of that in any neurosis. Because people have learned to hide themselves or to blame themselves, and the recent stuff we've done on guilt complexes comes into the mix here, as does the family complex. So all of these different perspectives are just part of one broad field, which is dynamic. It's informationally dynamic, and it shifts between expressions, but you're dealing with the field of a human being. And if we choose to say this is the mother complex, it might be really useful to consider that, but never out of the context of the family or of the result of that, which might be a guilt complex or an inferiority-superiority complex, for example. And then I've given 3 examples there that are really just 3 faces of the same thing. That's how this works. So if we want to focus on manifest symptoms, we can then meaningfully give that kind of informational diagnosis, field diagnosis. This is principally an inferiority complex, say, or a guilt complex, but actually they're connected. They're the same thing at one level. And if we break the connection between these foci, these dynamic bits that move around within the field overall of the complex, they start to atrophy in respect to one another as well. So that field perspective is so important to have.
So is that the internal transference that you were talking about the other day?
Yeah.
That on a seminar where complexes actually start to become competitive with one another,
Yes.
or aligned with one another in such a way that they create another system, and so on.
Yeah,
It's something to be aware of, isn't it?
they will compete under pressure.
Yeah.
And the pressure doesn't have to come from a therapist. It can come from ordinary life, externally, mixed perhaps with internal pressure, because a field, an infodynamic field, is not static. It can split. It can divide like a biological cell, and it can acquire new stuff. And then one part of that former field that is now 2 subfields may compete with one another. And what can happen then is that the ego is aware of a change in state on the inside, and then it interprets the internal world in the same way that it misunderstands the external world. And then the transference dynamic is not from within to without, but from without to within. And that's not the same as introjection, because we're dealing with a system which is infodynamic with its own drives. It's regulating itself. It doesn't really matter what the ego does, in that sense, but the transference model of that explains it better than introjection. I now blame that complex, and the other one feels better. I don't even know that the complexes. I'm just receiving representations, affects, misdirected intuitions that make me favor one part of my internal world, and then I blame the other and say, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't like that. That's more unpleasant. This one's offering me more, in effect. Therefore, I will align and then identify with that. And then the other one, which is split off and autonomous, will say, I'm not having this. I'm going to project out now and disrupt your external environment. And you'll find you can't rely on this newly reified internal image that you favor. And it really is like that, because we are internalizing things all the time, influences through fantasies and cultural representations. We don't realize that we're doing it because the ego thinks that's all there is. Jung was right about that. It focuses on itself. And yet there are other things that require information, fight amongst themselves, redirect instincts and so forth, and then you get an intractable neurosis.
So if you get a therapist who's in a similar state, you're pretty much stuffed, aren't you?
Yeah.
In the sense that the therapy's not going to go anywhere.
No.
Because, and this is what you were saying about Jung, really, it's so lamentable that he didn't develop his theory of complexes on more than he did. Because as we've often said, that's how we've come to have CBT. But some of that was, I think, to do with his own human journey and his own suffering, that his model went the way that it did. But clinically, unless you're in a position where you can go straight to the solution, which often you are, then a lot of the work that we do clinically is this is the stuff of clinical work, isn't it? Being able to work with your own complexes fundamentally first, and therefore being able to work with somebody else's, and knowing all the games, all the tricks they have up their sleeves, and will play.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they do indeed. Yeah, it seems complicated, and it only is if we collapse and focus. But if we have a wide field perspective, then the distribution of that complexity collapses itself and it becomes simpler.
Yeah.
Because everything we do affects every other part of everything that is related to whatever we're focused on.
Yeah.
And if we do it in the right way, then we can reconfigure people quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's why you get this sometimes with some people, this sort of typical presentation of moving between different therapists, different forms of therapy, and that one's failed, I'm going to move on to this one now. And really, it's just the activity of complexes.
Yeah.
Redirecting or diverting that person away from somebody, oftentimes it could help them if they were allowed to. And it continues on in that way. And then these are the games they play.
Yeah. So, excuse me. The way to approach this is simple, but there is complexity in that. But the complexity is only distribution. If you connect the distribution, you immediately get simplicity.
Yeah.
It's when it's fractionated.
Yeah.
That makes everything seem worse, and it does for the patients as well.
Mm.
And the wrong solution to that is to collapse into a dogma. Any of them, we must keep natural about how we relate to people. And as we were discussing off camera before with you guys together about the progression historically, we have to move through Freud and Adler, understand that, into Jung, into the ancestral psyche, into the new paradigm approaches that are being developed, and then see the continuity with the remote ancestral past and the present, which most people don't bother to think about.
No.
If anything, they regard the past as so remote it has no effect on them, but it has a huge effect, and it's, I say, so highly conserved that it's intruding all the time. And that intrusion gets interpreted by Freudians as the id, because people don't like it. They feel unpleasant. This is hostility. This is aggression. This is unbridled sexuality. That's all horrible. It's got to be repressed. That's only one part of the instincts. And they're usually frustrated. It's come out in a Panksepian drive, an exaggerated one, looking for a context. That was a very long answer. Sorry about that.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I mean, it did diverge a little bit from the original answer, but everything ties together neatly anyway. So everything's part of the discussion of today. So perfectly fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mladen. The question was a good one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Would anybody like to offer anything at this stage? Niamh.
Hi, just listening to all this and I suppose observing people in the 20s and that, there seems to be an awful lot of calibrating their lives off others. And I think that's where you've got your inferiority and superiority complex very active.
Yes.
And then we're back to, building your own vessel and building your own ego strength.
Yes.
So you have the ground. And I think it is part of, I suppose, the human condition to go through this at that particular age as well, when you're trying to build a sense of real identity and firm relationships.
Yes.
Yeah. So what you said there, Niamh, is a very direct and clear way of putting what I was saying earlier. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Because you've got the instinctive drive, pressure, the Freudian element, meeting the Adlerian element, and as you say, and as Jung observed, this is normal in the first half of life. We all have to go through these adaptations, and to some extent, they are contracted responses and adaptations in any individual. To what extent we have one or the other. And that was Adler's focus, of course, to say, to what extent is this person compensating for a sense of inferiority and overdoing it? So what does he or she need to do? They need to be interested in other people. That's maturity.
Mm-hmm.
And that sets aside all of the infantile stuff that Freud was focused on for Adler.
Yeah, but we're not seeing much of that maturity, though, are we? I think that's partly Niamh's point, in that we're seeing more almost of an extended adolescence in a way, and a reference to peer groups beyond a time that really would be, say, in previous generations would have been considered, time to move on, time to mature, wanting to remain puerile. in a way.
Yeah.
That's very sad. I mean, peer groups are important, of course, but beyond a certain point, they start to keep young people trapped within them. And then there is a failure to adapt, a failure to mature as a result of that.
Yeah.
And I do think we see a lot of that out there now in the culture, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Right, anybody else like to contribute at this stage? Oh, everybody happy. It's good to be happy. Even Freud says that. Okay, all right. So we can introduce now. Right, we'll go through the slides, and there's a couple at the end. One which describes, if you like, the field of an inferiority-superiority polarized neurosis, and then one that represents things that are useful in taking an approach to helping somebody who's suffering in this way. So here's somebody, it says, your inferiority complex, but looking at him, he doesn't think he's inferior, does he? This is the overcompensated inferiority that you get in exaggerated form with narcissists. Their inferiority is concealed, but this is also a representation of ordinary people where the meter's gone too far in the wrong direction. How you got it and what to do about it? Well, how we get it is it emerges out from our biology. So we have to have that in our approach. Most psychotherapies don't do that. They are psychoreductive. They collapse into a therapeutic dogma, and that is the level at which they operate. So biology is ignored, or where it's looked at, it's not integrated. It's separate. There is no superpositioning between mind and body in a meaningful, connected way for most psychotherapies. And for that, we have to look at Freud, of course, because Freud was a neurologist by training, a specialism within medicine. And in his day, it was neurologists that were working with these rather peculiar presentations that appeared, say, for Charcot and some of the other greats of their day. There were no psychotherapists. They didn't exist in current form at that time. The discipline had to be created. The nearest equivalent were mesmerists, and they were treated with suspicion at first, even though there were lots of medical practitioners in the late 18th and right through to the mid and late 19th century who were using hypnotic techniques to perform without analgesia amputations. This is all in the literature. You guys will be familiar with a lot of it. And doing other incredible things too, but the resistance to it, because it appeared to be occult, was very, very high. Freud himself joked about it being the dark arts, the occult, in other words. But it's no such thing, it's natural. But the evolution out from its beginnings of psychotherapy, through Charcot, later Janet, Freud, Jung, and others, was a bit of a torturous journey. But to do Freud justice, we have to acknowledge him. And these are some of the significant contributions that he made for consideration of an inferiority complex. The archaic heritage. So it's not just unconscious drives, which he's best known for, the form of the id. There's also the vestiges, because he also called them archaic remnants as well as heritage, of past collective adaptations based on our species and on our evolution. When he fell out with Jung, one of the aspects of that was where he basically said that I thought of this before you did, but you're putting too much value on it. He thought the archaic heritage is real, but it's not like these weird fantasies and religious delusions that you're talking about. And in the same way, he also withdrew from the notion of complexes too, except for the Oedipus and castration complex, which is a pity, because why are there only two? If only they'd stayed together and they'd been open to exchange, we would have moved on a great deal. Or if Jung, as I say, we both said before. If he'd have worked with complexes, we'd be 100 years ahead of where we are now. It's really that bad. But, to be fair, he did understand that there was a role for the ancestral psyche. But he was looking at frustration and hostility and the process of repression and conversion, say, into hysteria, as being what happens when instincts are frustrated. And that would mean that for him, you then get what Adler was interpreting differently. And as we were saying earlier about Freud saying that all symptoms are aimed at someone, and he was looking at the disturbance within the social field that's implicit and indeed explicit in what he's saying, but he didn't put the remedy in the context of society as such. It was more to do with the individual being analysed about their frustrated libidinous desires that were coming up to such a point of pressure they had to be repressed. And he saw this painted in his stages of psychosexual development, which are obviously biological as they unfold. And then the psychic apparatus, as he later called it, the id, the so-called unconscious, which is the representation of the archaic heritage of modern people for Freud. The ego, which he was very interested in maintaining the health of, and then the superego, which was basically the projection of morality and control beyond the boundary of the individual, starting with the parents and to any kind of authority role. And then the idea of the pleasure principle, which is in service of the id, gratification, versus the reality principle, which is orientation to the superego and its constraints. And for him, that determined where the manifestation of inferiority and superiority that Adler was picking up from came from. And they are all elements potentially of that, but we can't really collapse into it. The paradox is we can't collapse into it, but we can't ignore it. So we have to come to some kind of understanding of Freud, including his limitations, but also where he is present at an Adlerian level. And as you know, in the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation, we say Freud seeks Adler. So instinct, positive and negative, seeks its expression psychosocially. Otherwise, it implodes. And the implosion of frustrated instinct is a Freudian neurosis, classical Freudian neurosis. So Freud had a lot to contribute. And the second door to understanding is Adler, the equivalent of the second turning of the wheel in Buddhism. Mahayana, open to everyone. And Adler's very social. He's open to everyone. Now, he thought that there was a fundamental sense of inferiority experienced by all children because they can't control their environment. They rely on parents. But beyond that, if they happen, as he was, to be born with some kind of, in his case, physical disorder, then that would need compensating for. And this was the sense of inferiority he had. He felt he needed to overcompensate for. He called that striving for superiority. So when he examined himself in his own timeline, he found that. But he also found neurotic alibis, which is basically where the ego generates a fantasy for itself. So we're in the realm of fantasy again, by which it explains itself to itself. And nothing happens. They get stuck. But for Adler, they're stuck at the level of inferiority and the attempt to overcompensate for that. This generates something called private logic, which is something that we can all experience in others, but I would always say be careful about deploying that idea. That somebody's way of thinking is a bit strange. It doesn't serve outer reality. It doesn't serve social interest. It doesn't serve relating. But it does serve the sense of inferiority for Adler. So private logic and neurotic alibi are connected. They're part of the same field for him. And then he said there'd be something like a guiding fiction. And Adlerians can use that to attack Jung and say that their interest in fantasy and in religion and the like was a guiding fiction which made sense in some way of their sense of inferiority. So they have to elevate themselves in a religious way. So you have this insight that no one else has. So there's something special about you and it's religious. It's a guiding fiction. And Adler would predict that the guiding fictions paired with neurotic alibis and private logic lead to lack of social interest, reinforce the sense of inferiority, and lead to neurotic collapse. Then he said there was something called fictional finalism, which is a kind of corruption of the telic, that is to say, the intentional direction of life. And it would be on these lines: if only I can do that, if only I achieve that, all my problems will go. Therefore, the guiding fiction is directed towards fictional finalism. But it's an illusion which conceals the underlying sense of inferiority, but contains the neurotic alibis, the private logic, and makes a person feel, well, I'm okay, I'm thinking perfectly well about this, I understand this. But deep down, there is the division based on something that needs to be compensated for. And in essence, he said, in the end, the solution will be a maturity into social interest. That would be the solution for neurotic narcissism. A neurotic narcissist is not a genetic narcissist. And when they can solve everything that goes before this level for an Adlerian, because they have dealt with this through having social interest, they immediately go beyond themselves and the narcissism is gone. That will not happen with a dark triad type. It just won't. But it will happen with someone who's been traumatized in some way and has been split, and then follows an apparent Adlerian path, but is secretly also suffering from Freudian issues. So yes, Freud seeks Adler. Adler conceals Freud. And we know what follows from that. Jung, the third door, the third turning of the wheel of the psychoanalytic Dharma. So as we know, Jung, a very, very complicated personality. An amazing creativity, actually. He would have been a brilliant fiction writer had he chosen to do that. I'm sure he could have taken on Tolkien and all the others and produced some really first-class literature. Arguably he did. And it was fictional. And then he said it was, because he said his personal myth in Memories, Dreams and Reflections was not the truth, because nobody could tell the truth about themselves. So he said, I undertake to tell my personal myth. Very cleverly. That's a very clever literary device, really, to say, here's my story. I'm not saying it's true, but it's my story, and because it's mine, it's real. That gets him off the hook. It takes away all of the responsibilities. Private logic, guiding fiction, fictional finalism is individuation. It could be said.
It could.
But that's really the conflict between these three great pioneers, that they malignantly interpret one another's work instead of seeing there's value in all of them, but we do have to temper them. So when it comes to narcissism, then he would look at the capacity for this, and what we would say would be the genome. He would think of the archetypes and the collective unconscious as being determining factors of a psychological nature that extend ultimately beyond mere psychology and into the ground state of the universe. In that, he was really on message. But once he starts to locate archetypes in specific myths, religions, fairy tales, and then encourages his students to do the same, they are only copying him, and they're not undergoing what he said was important, which was an original experience of their own. So for Jung, then, narcissism will be presaged in the collective unconscious. We would say in the genome. It's anticipated by meta instincts that it will happen. There will be scenarios in which that is useful as an adaptation, and others it won't, but it's there. Ego developments. For him, the ego emerged out from the unconscious. There's all sorts of variations on this from post-Jungians about the ego self-axis and the like, as a way of attempting to understand that. But the important thing about ego development for Jung is, and he did make a contribution here, which he didn't push hard enough on it. I'll explain why in a minute. That understanding of symbolism, where the ego separates itself off from that and starts to reality orientate, that determines maturity set against constraints that we all have as individuals. So our potential is constrained, but still pushes on us from the moment that our ego starts to develop. So in other words, we develop an individuation neurosis right from the get-go. It's unavoidable. And he would refer people to Adler and say, make sure you tick all the Adlerian boxes before you start to tackle this as an adult in middle age. If you're younger than that, you may not have had enough life experience. There will be exceptional people. But of course, narcissists of the genetic kind regard themselves as being very exceptional. So they will be drawn to the idea that they can individuate before midlife, and they will push themselves out there in contemporary times as an internet guru and cult leader if they can pull it off. He also talked about the shadow, and that's a convenient way of describing what it is like for the ego to develop out from the unconscious and feel the separation. And it then becomes, that is not me, but somehow it is. But I'm me, and I'm developing, and I'm moving away, but there's this thing I'm leaving behind. And it has within it representations that I'm now finding fearful. And I don't remember what it was like to not feel that fear. And that's because the ego wasn't properly developed. It hadn't split into ego and shadow. That is a split. And the relationship to the mother, of course, as we've discussed, is key in how a child of both biological genders learns to trust their inner world enough to separate from it, and therefore not acquire a dangerous sense of division that could be considered to be the shadow, as Jungians understand that. So when the personal unconscious, the personal ego starts to separate off from the unconscious through the mediation of the mother and then the father, then this sense of a shadow self emerges, but also the anima and the animus. The mother is no longer just the mother in a Melanie Klein way of providing nurture and comfort. She is also then the representation of the unconscious for the boy. And the mother complex and the anima then are simply facets of the same field of relationship to the non-ego of the boy, which is mediated through the representation of the mother. The animus for women, I think Jung was too polarized over that, because women have the same kind of experience of the mother as boys do, but there's the addition of the father being male and different in biological sex and gender to her, that adds that additional layer to that she will relate to the mother in order to understand the masculine. So she's still going through the mother, but it's not called the anima. So the Jungians have to perform alchemy and say, well, it's the mother complex. But in the boy, the mother complex and the anima for Jungians are so closely bonded, they're almost inseparable, except conceptually at a cognitive level. But what we're saying is it's the same thing for both biological sexes, but there's a little additional twist, if you like, for the experience of being a woman, of how she learns to trust her unconscious, but then she learns to trust the outer world through her father. That's genetically encoded and highly conserved, even if it doesn't work out that way in reality for an individual developing female child. There is still an expectation that is conserved and becomes projected. And if it doesn't land properly, then there's a sense of incongruence with respect to the genome and its meta instincts. Well, I'm somehow, they won't say this consciously, but I am somehow expecting this man who is significant in my life to make the world safe for me and to confirm me as a woman as being different from him. How's my mother relating to him? And you can see an awful lot of pathology comes from that. Each of these elements can contribute to an Adlerian understanding of an inferiority complex, because that's a rational response from a meta-instinctive level to these kinds of frustrations. In the same way that when we look at Freudian frustrations, we see that the inferiority-superiority complex at the level of Adler take on that determining direction. In other words, the wound is Freudian, And the complex moves that way into the level of Adler. Here, though, early development, which is both Freudian and Jungian simultaneously, they're not separate, determines which of those is relatively weighted the stronger, the higher valency of influence, and we can then find the inferiority complex shift towards the Jungian pathologies that will turn up later in life. So Jung openly said that he wasn't particularly interested in childhood, and he left that to Freud. And he wasn't particularly interested in social development. He left that to Adler. He was interested in the second half of life and individuation as an unfolding process. But to get there, he understood it was going to be important to deal with issues of power, because power is about relating. Control, or to be controlled through relating. What is it that relates for the Jungians? Although they don't actually articulate it this way, it is the anima or the animus, because they are the proto-representations of what it is like to be beyond yourself, to relate to others, and to relate to the wider world. As I said before, both children, particularly the boy, but both children learn to trust or not to trust the inner world and the relationship to it through the medium of the relationship to the mother, and to the outer world, again for both, through the relationship to the father. But it's more critical for girls than it is for boys, because boys naturally form masculine-based, meta-instinctively driven groups that engage with the world in a way which is congruent with the idea of the father. But as Jung put it, the father is different. It is not the same for a young woman. So if she's not allowed to learn how to be safe in the world through the father, then the compensation at the inferiority-superiority level and its overcompensation will operate through what Jung called the animus. But it's just relating. It's not collapsible only into that. It's all kinds of relating, because it includes relationships to our metabolism, to our gene expression, not just the psychology of the inner world, but the full drop down, right down into our molecular biology, and then into the physics of our very matter that makes it up. All of that, and then beyond. So this is why we've moved beyond emphasizing animus, and we look at relating, for example. And the shadow is, yes, rightly, as Jung said, that first psychosocial complex that forms, because it's the sense of separation, but of presence. It's a disintegration of wholeness that occurs, and we start to leave the so-called unconscious behind, and that means the instincts are left behind. But the instincts want us, paradoxically, to leave them behind. So we can then access the world, because under ideal conditions, instincts will control the ego and will direct the ego. You don't need to look in under ideal conditions, start tinkering around with things, and then internalize this kind of model as it's exaggerated by Jungians and inflated by them, that mess up natural relationships. And suddenly the shadow is many things. Suddenly the shadow is only the personal unconscious. And then it's more than that. It's everything that is not the ego, and so on. So the concept of the shadow is amorphous, and it extends all over the place. That tells us it's a field that exists in different states, and it tells us that the ego is not meant to look at it. It's meant to be externally focused. That's in agreement with Freud. It's in agreement with biology and evolution. The people who insist on looking in on the inside then start to turn these stages of adaptation into things that they are not, through fantasy, which can feed into the inferiority-superiority overcompensation that we were mentioning earlier. So someone who is precociously informed by Jung and has an inferiority-superiority adaptive issue will suddenly see the shadow everywhere. The animus is everywhere. Parental complexes through transference are everywhere. They have an arrested ego development, but never mind, there's the fantasies of archetypes And they're everywhere too, because I've only got to look in culture and religion and mythology and fantasy and fairy tales, because Carl Jung said that's where we find them. We do. We find them because they are dumped there as collective representations of conserved ancestral experience within a culture. But they also exist in a natural state within us. And if we let that come through, because homeostasis wants it to come through, across lifespan development, we suddenly find we get on with ourselves. We get along, we feel okay enough to adapt to the external world. And then the so-called unconscious looks after itself, which it prefers to do, rather than be interfered with by an ego that's going beyond its proper boundary by going inside. But Jung's greater clarification on the power complex was that inferiority produces superiority compensations. Superiority produces inferiority compensations. And that's the level that he would come in at to deal with that. And there is traction in it, so long as it's not too extended into opposites, which Jungians love. They love the extremes of opposites. It's as if they can't be conscious of something unless it's divided into two things which are clearly different but somehow connected. Whereas when it comes to adaptation to the world, the entire bandwidth between those opposites are all playable options. So we can move between them. That's something the Jungians, because they're so obsessed with opposites and dualities, find difficulty with. So when it comes to inferiority-superiority compensations for one another, then they will try to regulate the one with the other, but always by reference to the model itself, not to natural processes. Anima, animus, in relationship to inferiority, superiority. Shadow, likewise. Parental complexes, likewise. Everything is referred to a dualistic model. So they have some insight, but that insight is constrained by the dogma. So that's been a problem, and still is. And it's a problem for non-professional Jungians who learn off internet gurus and just casually read books, because they're just internalizing things that they have no experience of. And the experience you have has to be more than just you. It's got to be with other people. That has to be the acid test. So what we're saying is that this approach is a new synthesis. It's getting on now. It's 46 years old, so not exactly new. But the infodynamic revolution is this notion that we go beyond psychodynamics and find something which can consolidate further and build upon the past, but introduce new elements that are coming in from different disciplines. And in this, we acknowledge Anthony Stevens as being the leading figure historically in the establishment of this new paradigm. As we can see, he was a Jungian analyst, a psychiatrist, an evolutionary psychologist, a human ethologist, the founder of the new paradigm in depth psychology, and he was one of our mentors, and we acknowledge and respect that. Now, when he looks at inferiority, superiority, although he acknowledges Adler, he does, or did, of course, approach it in a conservative way. That Adler's useful in some regards, but only to compare to Jung, and then to compare Jung and Adler with his other fields, so to speak, of interest. So what does all of that mean in relationship to evolutionary psychology, psychiatry, mental illness, to the process of being a Jungian analyst and analyzing patients, and then to human ethology, the natural study of people in natural environments? You combine all of that together, there are so many powerful leverage tools there to go beyond a collapse into Freud, Jung, and Adler. You go into many, many other things, but also avoid collapse into them. But what he would do, and did do, was interpret inferiority, superiority in terms of rank theory, which is completely independent of the three people that I've mentioned. But it draws on a lot of consolidated experience and information from other disciplines to do with what happens when somebody loses status. when they lose their rank. And for a social animal, particularly social mammals, it can be fatal. And that would have been part of the adaptive process with Darwin in the past. And we took this very seriously. And you may have heard me say this, but I used to work with people a lot who blushed. I used to get a lot of referrals for that from medics to use hypnosis to stop blushing. And their view is all blushing is some kind of hormonally, behaviorally conditioned response that involves dilation of blood vessels in the face. And this was embarrassing. So how about you do your wizardry, and just change it. It didn't understand what we did. And that is a cognitive level of approach to someone who doesn't need to be treated in that way. But there is a solution which can be represented in the right way when you deliver it properly that draws on the ancestral psyche to do with, well, where's this likely to have come from in our conserved past? Now, before we do what I'm about to tell you about, because if I don't put that context in, it's going to look rather brutal. We have to prepare a person to receive that understanding. And it's like this, basically, that when a human being, now that we have, for the most part, hairless faces, when they lose status within a group, when they become embarrassed and they blush, that is a signal, a highly conserved evolutionary adaptive signal to say, I have lost status, but don't harm me. I'm inviting you to dominate me, but at the same time, accept my subdominance and protect me, keep me as part of the group. That's at a human level. And we go back further, and then we find some primates display color changes in their rear end and invite symbolic or real mountings, for example, even between males, where it's not sexual in the obvious reproductive sense, but it contains libido, expresses it symbolically to do with dominance, and then protection. Now, to put that to a human being, a person in a modern context who is blushing terribly in certain circumstances would be brutalizing if they were not prepared for it. But once you use hypnosis in the right way and you access the healing part of homeostasis, then it's amazing what can change and how you word what you say, how you present your language patterning will go deeply within, and then the suggestions which are acceptable to homeostasis, that there is no need to signal like this, the time for that is gone. And it's okay for you. And this is where the reversal of the inferiority-superiority comes in. It's okay for you to not do that, but take your place and be respected for that. You don't have to be subdominant to appear to be weak so that other people won't criticize you, attack you, and the like. There's that element. And then there's your positive potential is greater than that. And part of your embarrassment is in front of yourself on the inside, that you're not yet allowing yourself to release that. And when you do, there'll be no need, no desire, no reason to signal in that way anymore. Now, you couch that properly, and suddenly, well, I don't have to be inferior, superior, overcompensating, showing off through my face a highly conserved signal of subdominance, because really, I am far more competent than my peer group, my family, my work space, than any of them know. But I'm afraid of my potential because they will all turn on me. And that's what happened when I was a child, and I blushed in that moment, and a complex formed, and the meta instinct said, yes, this is what it was like all that time ago, when we were paleo hominids on the African savannah, when you had to, in order to survive, reduce your competence, so then you were not a threat to people who were, other troop members who would kill you. Of course, don't put it quite like that, but in such a way that brings about that compensation and things change. All of this put together, and then you add that to infodynamic field theory, altered states of consciousness. You build on Freud-Adler-Jung, and you work with real people suffering in the way that they really suffer. You've got a very, very powerful approach. So that's an evolutionary perspective. And just to illustrate this is the ancestral psyche again. And this was in the guilt complex video. Remember, guilt complexes and inferiority complexes, the social expressions of regulation within a context that is not only then, it's highly conserved, it's also now. It's in the family, school, peer groups, relationships. And there are ways of dealing with that. And society has regulatory ways of dealing with that. So illegitimate guilt then is the thing where it is distorted into an inferiority or superiority position. We mentioned that in the video that we did on the guilt complex, the difference between legitimate guilt, which there are social structures to heal and repair, and illegitimate guilt, which is neurotic, and will always have constellated with it feelings of inferiority and superiority, which have been mixed and mashed and moved around, but never quite settling into resolution. So this is, if you like, the Palaeolithic Scene. They're not looking behind them. And it's a bit late to do that now because it's all about to end. And this idea then, that there are ways of dealing with this kind of environment through an Adlerian solution to the problem, which we'll get to later. But they're external threats. This is the internal threat that can happen within a primitive hierarchy. The elements of this are still conserved within us. Inferiority equals loss of rank and becoming subdominant. Now, it may be fatal, or it may just be punishment just to knock somebody down. But this is what can happen, a compensating superiority and then an increase in rank and status by asserting it. This is the thing that a person with a superiority complex will not do. The person with a superiority complex in a modern context would actually prefer this as an outcome to that. Whereas the person with an inferiority complex strives for superiority in a corrupted Adlerian way. And this can be the outcome then, and it's the outcome now. And we see it's highly conserved in dark triad types, for example. Self-interest, self-promotion, elevation, inflation, and control of people who should know better. But here's an Adlerian solution. The group, they work together. They understand it. So the predators are kept away by fire. Fire as a social tool. That's Arva's social interest. And to him, that solves the problem. The Jungian solution, though, is more mystical and involves shamanistic levels of insight and apparent understanding. But if we jump to this level before we've sorted out the others, it's hollow, it's fake, it's not there at all. It's an anticipation of what might be, but only if we do the work. So the superiority complex may compensate their social schizoid withdrawal by compensatory fantasies like this, or it may involve going out and trying mushrooms and drugs and whatever of various psychedelic kinds in order to gain some illegitimate attempt at synthesis and understanding. Illegitimate because it is based only on a chemical exogenous substance. And when that substance goes, the insight and the states go, and they're not left with an integrated personality. Now in our contemporary world, well, what about that? Remember, the conservation of these ancient configurations means that we can get this. Overcompensated superiority, a withdrawal into playing video games, fantasies, taking substances, drugs, not engaging with the real world. And by his appearance, you can see that that's likely to be going on for this young man here. Through the video game, he overcompensates. He becomes the game master. And he can control that environment. And there are some frustrations, but there's some relief. They're virtual, though. So Freud pours into the representation as much as it can. And so does Adler. But there's an emptiness in such a person's soul, which is the gap that positive Jung should feel. They are deeply suffering. What about overcompensated inferiority in our present culture? Well, here we have it. The narcissist with his acolytes, the sub-narcissists who are feeding off the leading narcissist who controls the group and just soaks it all up. This is wonderful for him. But inside him will be a massive sense of inferiority, which means he will need that adoring group of subjects around him, because without that, then all of those inner doubts will surface and he will fracture. So the presentation has to be aggressive, bombastic, and most of all, controlling of other people. So what's our starting point in the practical sense then? In a practical psychotherapeutic sense, we need to draw on Jung and Adler, but consider everything else that we've discussed. I mentioned the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation, which is how we deliver this, how we deliver specifically Adler and Jung. Also, of course, making sure that Freud doesn't run riot and take over Adler and then misdirect Jung. So we have to know about the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation. Now we have the ontology of a power complex. And we can start at the bottom of this, Platonic field infodynamics. That's the basis of everything. And what we have here is the progression for dark triad pathology and the progression here for neurotic pathology. So at the beginning then, we have instantiation as Darwinian pressure. That's the first thing that happens. The Darwinian selective pressure emerges out of the genome to force an adaptation. But it's constrained by the set points of that genome. The character of the individual themselves is set. So we then get innate dark triad pathology, which is released, genomic timed release of character through lifespan development. And this is also delivered into the external world through frustrated meta-instincts and Panksepian drives. Frustrated because there is no satiation for a dark triad, a true dark triad type. They cannot be satiated. They must continually gratify themselves. And then we may get additional developmental or reactionary dark triad pathology sitting on top of the primary. And this can misdirect therapists, because they may allow us to see this, the developmental element, but conceal this and that behind that. Now, as they develop as young people, then Freud's id and superego pathologies will take shape. Why? Why does it? Because it's so fundamental to the biology of dark triad people, their sense of inferiority, that exactly what Freud was seeing tends to appear in them quite clearly. That beneath everything else, you find Freud's id. You also find the critical superego as well, which probably came from their resistance to their parents and the constraints on their character when they were children. This is exactly where Freud got these ideas from. Not that everybody saw dark triad pathology, but those observations become amplified exponentially within a dark triad individual. So Freudian pathology is at the root of all dark triad people. And then when that gets to Adler's level, striving to overcome his sense of inferiority or her sense of inferiority, everything gets appropriated to that functionally, because this will satisfy that. And that's part of the Freud-Adler-Jung equation. And then we get Jung's compensatory pathology as well, the inflation of the would-be guru and cult leader. If the opportunity arises for such people, they will rise, if I can call it a rise, it's a descent really, to that level of control over other people's lives, because that satisfies this, it satisfies that, and that. What it means is that whatever is good in this can't get through. because it's the layering of all of this which is superpositioned within itself and then arises ultimately at the level of Jung's compensatory pathology. But this is different to this, which is ordinary neurotic pathology. We all have instantiation of Darwinian pressure to actualize. We all have that. So innate normal genomic potential, normal can still be very high. It's just not corrupted at a genomic level. The genomic timed release of character, that which is innate within an ordinary person. And there's such a bandwidth of ordinariness, many, many ways of living an authentic life, that we are bound to have frustrated meta-instincts and pansapian drives. This is normal. And this, of course, is normal developmental adaptive challenges that appear as Freud's id and superego pathology initially. Some people hang on to that because it settles there primarily, but it doesn't stay there. It moves into Adler, but you still see the Freudian element. But they're not dark triad types. This is just how the complex is formed and unfolded. Adler striving to overcome inferiority, as he would understand it, turns up as Jung's compensatory pathology again. But this is a very different kind of configuration of Jung than you get on this side. Very, very different. So how do we look at dealing with this? This is the healing field, and this all derives from inner work. You could reconfigure any of these in any order, provided you follow the basics. And on the left here, we have natural altered states of consciousness. There is no utilization of them, they just occur naturally. There's no understanding of them by other people, let alone by the person concerned. On the other side, we have hypnosis, which is something that requires development as a skill. So natural altered states of consciousness are expressed through hypnosis. Here we have dissociation and representation, which is common to everyone. But over this side, that is augmented and complemented by an understanding of the metaqualia of consciousness. The metaqualia determine representation. The metaqualia are that which are dissociated and reassociated. So when they are connected consciously through hypnosis and via natural altered states of consciousness, then we're already building something which is very, very helpful. Dialectical imagery and related forms of engaging with representation and creative therapies both deal with symbols. Symbols are representations. But creative therapy and dialectical imagery both involve dissociation of representations. And of course, the metaqualia, hypnosis, natural states, all within the remit of inner work. All of this is working together. Personal myth work, if people go into that properly and in depth, they're going to find their deep structure, complex engagements. At that point, they can see what Adler would call neurotic alibis, fictional finalism, private logic. That's how he would, or his model would interpret deep structure complexes. The personal myth work identifies them, but transforms them. Enactment process work is similar to tantric style infodynamic conversion. In other words, things are turned into something else through tantric style processes. You get this with enactments. It's very quick. It's quicker than tantrism. Non-duality means there are no opposites. Everything is a single field of a heterogeneous nature because it's made up of different things. When we know that and can become comfortable with it, then we immediately start to take the power away from complexes which thrive on duality. And this is paired with superpositioning our progress, inner and outer. What is within, so too is without, and vice versa. Non-duality, the same extended field which we can engage with and bring about change. Non-inflationary compensations, really important, because that means we're stepping away from fantasy in the way that Freud understood fantasy to be potentially malignant. This will lead to a reconfigured self-concept. and a reconfigured self-image as the focus of the self-concept. A reality and not fantasy-based life. Timed release, lifespan development is a natural process augmented by homeostasis. And that essentially is a representation, incomplete, but it's exemplary in a way that it draws together different things. But when all of those things are brought together, and you don't have to focus on all of them, they start to configure one another relationally because of the field nature of them, then everything will reconfigure, and you get what the Jungians look for in terms of their understanding of individuation. You certainly overcome the power complex and inferiority-superiority dynamics. Okay, I'll stop there. Yeah, it's been quite a heavy one, that. I'm running the last 15 minutes. Would anybody like to offer anything for discussion or clarification on what we've covered? Anything at all? A simple, gentle prompt would do. Hiya, Jess.
Hi. So can you hear me?
Yes, we
Go
can.
ahead, yeah.
Is there always going to be a relating function complex at the core of inferiority or superiority?
That's a great question. I would say yes, because it's relating that shows that there is a problem with respect to inferiority and superiority, and the power complex like that develops because something went wrong with relating, that we identify with enough to consolidate an Adlerian inferiority-superiority complex. So they are connected. There is a field relationship between them. And as relating literally means relating to anything and everything, then it follows from that potentially a complex can occupy any state and still be the same complex. But at core, it will be that in resonance with relating as such. So if we fix relating, we fix that. If we don't, then that fixes relating negatively.
Okay, thanks. And there's just something else I'm trying to tease out. It's like our social structures are hierarchical. So, I mean, in a way, some people do need to dominate
Yeah.
in society, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, how do you, I guess it does just come back to the relating, because, some people might have a sense of inferiority. I don't really know what I'm getting at here, but there's something missing in my understanding about, like some people, maybe just a little bit shy or just a little bit arrogant, but we're talking about more, I guess, pathological situations here when people are presenting in therapy because they're really struggling. That's when you see these kind of complexes, and it's different from just kind of normal different social structures.
Yeah, that's very well stated. And what we find is that the meta instincts that are conserved within us that anticipate optimal adaptations can contract to suboptimal ones. So therefore they are options in order to accommodate everyone on whatever level of, in the hierarchical sense. They're horrible expressions, aren't they? Dominance, but that's the way the disciplines address it. But there are some people who are not so forthcoming, but by doing that, they actually become more effective at making other changes. So homeostasis agrees, and that's a good thing that it does. It's when it doesn't agree that we all suffer. It's either because we're too inflated or we're too deflated, basically. That's when the objection arises from within, and we find incongruence with our relationship on the outside. And if we double down on either of those, we become a problem to ourselves and other people. And very often that doubling down comes around because of traumatic events, micro-traumas perhaps, conditioning along a timeline, and then the responses generate a complex that we give into, and the complex goes off and says, I'll manage all of this. And then suddenly we disagree with it, and it's no, I'm sorry, I constrain you. You do as I want you to do, because it's in your best interests. That's the progression that we get. It starts off positive, then it gets a bit threatening, and then it tries to take over because of the autonomy of the split that occurred on Jungian partitioning and the repression. I forgot I did that. And I wanted to forget because this was such a bloody awful situation. I'd rather generate something which is a neurotic alibi or wherever it might be. And then I slip down the ranks, but my genome says, what are you doing? What are you doing? I'll push. And complex says, I'll receive what you push and I'll distribute it. Some of it I'll project and cause problems. Some of it I'll borrow from my own energy, but I'll keep it away from the ego so it never even receives it. And the genome says, I'm not getting through. I'll push harder. And then there's a fight between the genome and complexes, or the complex field. And the meta instinct starts to try and adjust to what's going on homeostatically. And it might say, this is not ideal, but we'll settle for this. And then we get an impression forming in our mind based on our meta instinct's autonomous movement towards the ego that says, occupy the back of the pack, because at least that's something. And then the genome says, what are you doing? And pushes harder again. And then we have an adaptive, maladaptive neurotic configuration.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Thank you. So in practice, we don't need to communicate any of this necessarily. Sometimes to people we do. But if we use the right methods, the self-correction emerges because suddenly the opportunity that is real and is beyond them comes from another person, albeit through the field of the therapy. Yeah. The genome says it can be easy, can't it? Yes, let's make this easy. And we'll reduce the tension. We won't push so hard because the complex is being isolated. And the ego suddenly feels better. And things occur to it. Intuition starts to work. Positive rather than negative intuition that's been downloaded by a complex, all gone. And the person actualizes. So much more efficient and effective than years of analysis or bullying by a cognitive therapist. It'd be great to do without them, wouldn't it? We don't need you. You're just a bully. I'll do this for myself. Yeah. Thanks, Jess. Anyone else like to make an observation? It's been a heavy one, hasn't it? Oh, you said about people being shy.
I just think the last lot of
Yes, of course. Yes.
you've had, with Jess there, has encapsulated so much that if you really dissect that,
Let's see if I can find it.
I think you can find a solution to everything in that.
Yeah. Let's see what we can come up with. Excuse me for a moment. Right. Let's get that off. Go to share. Got too many windows open. That looks like it. Is that the one, Niamh? Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, that's it.
So we can make it a bit bigger. Yes, what would you like to comment on or suggest?
No, it was just the way you encapsulated everything there with Jess about, superiority and inferiority. And I actually had a discussion with my husband about it, like if we went back to Paleolithic times, it still existed that there was a leader of the pack. But the thing about it was that they looked up to these people.
Yeah.
Whereas, there was cooperation and respect, which seems to be lacking.
Yeah. You definitely get subdominant men, for example, grouping around these internet gurus. They can't see into the feebleness of the stability of the guru. But what you would get then is a group of men who will function together. And in the right kind of environment, that can have a payoff. So it persists enough to be a problem, but to have a minimum amount of return under certain conditions. But it's a real problem for the young men of today.
So they become a stable system.
Yeah,
In fact,
they do.
Yeah.
Collapsed into itself,
Yeah.
and they have associated ideas and points of reference which are delusional very often,
Oh yeah.
and they get trapped. But the predator, and they are these people, these malignant narcissists, will
Yeah.
farm them
Yeah.
for their life force. Sad, isn't it?
So you could have been able to see them coming, haven't you? Like that image with the predators, the Palaeolithic scene with the predators
Yeah.
coming from behind. I mean, it made me think of a lot of seasoned police officers, for example, in a modern context. If they go out socially, then they tend not to sit with their back
Yeah.
to the door, for example. I mean, you can see how it's exactly the same thing, except the poor people in that particular representation, unfortunately, weren't doing that.
No.
And so they weren't aware of what was the predation that was coming for them from behind. So it pays to be aware in that way, socially.
It does. Yeah.
And, that way you don't get taken by surprise.
Yeah, there's so much that's conserved from the past. The men in particular, I'll speak to men because you should speak to women, of course. They don't realize what they're doing. Mixed martial arts, for example, is really a highly ritualized and conserved form of paleo-hominid dominance hierarchies turned into a sport, a brutal sport, where head injuries now are beginning to show. Gareth was into MMA and he was into training in it, and he's fortunately got out of it because of repeated blows to the head, and because of what he's doing with his biomedical science degree, he's getting access to statistics to show this enormous leap in it. So rationally, why are they doing it? There isn't a rational reason by a contemporary situation, but in a paleo-hominid environment, then dominance like that is important. I remember saying years ago to people who were doing that kind of thing, because we did have contact with them at the highest level through the film industry. We're saying, well, what worked in the Paleolithic is what works now. And they thought, oh, you mean like MMA? I said, no, I don't. I mean a sharpened stone on the end of a stick. Because that brought down megafauna. If you can bring down a mammoth with something like that, you can bring down any man who ever lived with that. And then I said, MMA in classical Greece was pancration. Alexander the Great set out to conquer the known world, but he didn't take an army of pancration fighters with him. He took an army of people who were, a large number of them, armed with 20-foot-long spears, the phalanx, and specialist troops, the slingers, archers, mountaineers, light cavalry, heavy infantry, and so forth. He had combined arms. No MMA fighters, they wouldn't have survived the first battle. They'd all been wiped out. So why is it still there? Because there are meta instincts conserved from our very remote past, which are acted out. And because of the frustration in young men now, martial arts has moved from being culture, representative of other cultures and religions and so forth, into violent sports. And it's been around long enough now for the damage to show. But that's only because of instincts, like you're saying, Niamh. It would have been useful once to establish a dominance hierarchy. Well, somebody worked out that if I stick this sharpened piece of flint in the back of your head, that's the end of your dominance. And now it's a knife, or it's a gun, or a missile, or whatever. But they're all force multipliers. but it's still conserved. It's like the genome hasn't shed that. It still pushes it.
I'm just reminded of that field marshal that you sent me this morning, because I think somebody did mention about positive leaders as well, people that we can look up to, in that hierarchical sense, that we can look up to naturally and respect, and reminded me of that field marshal.
There's a Victorian guy, wasn't he?
Yes, who won the Victoria Cross for his bravery, and according to the description of him, he was quite a small guy as well, physically, in terms of his stature, but obviously commanded the respect of his men. I mean, I think it said he led an army of 10,000 men. And it's just incredible.
Well, he led from the front in line times when that's not supposed to happen. And he did things which, you'd see in a boy's own sort of comic book in the 19th century in all sorts of places. And he died in his 80s in the First World War, visiting sick men. And he caught pneumonia, but he wouldn't, he cared about people. Anyway.
No, but that's the difference, isn't it? That is a true hero. And it's right that we should look up to people like that who are of good character, but nonetheless lead. And we might think of them as being above us in a hierarchical sense. We can look up to them and we trust them sufficiently that we can, certainly under those circumstances, and we're talking about the men that he led, who put their lives on the line to go with him. That's a completely different thing, isn't it? To be, to me, misdirected by an internet guru, let's say. Well, yes, by comparison. So it's not even so much as it that we should dispense with hierarchies necessarily. It's who occupies the particular positions within that hierarchy, because some people prefer to lead, just like you're saying about Cesar Millan and the way that dogs organize themselves in packs. Some like to lead, some are happy to be at the back of the pack, so long as the pack works as a whole, and that's a good thing. That's the positive side of it. And it's the same with people.
It is.
But when you follow somebody who is a dark triad type and essentially malevolent, nothing good comes from that ultimately.
No. Yeah, great point, Niamh.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Thanks for all that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Niamh.
Would anybody like to comment on this slide or any of the others? Was everyone okay? I'm happy if you want to.
But again, just following on the one that preceded this one, Steve.
This one?
Yes, that one.
Yeah.
Again, I just following on again from the dark triad thing. What is suggestive of, if somebody is configured in that way, then the Platonic field will not ingress into someone who is configured in that way, because the vessel is corrupted. So it's never going to happen. And so in terms of our own social relationships, it comes down to our ability, doesn't it, to some extent, to be able to see the difference. And sometimes that difference doesn't emerge for some time if you're in relationship to that particular individual. The relationship might have to be pressure tested over time for you to know ultimately whether that's the case or not. But I think that is a very obvious distinction that you could make between the dark triad pathology and the neurotic pathology.
Yeah, they can appear to be the same.
They can.
That's all down to the manipulation of persona by the dark triad type.
Yeah.
And the inability of the ordinary person who suffers to regulate their persona.
Yeah.
So they're always more obvious.
Yes.
Which is horrible. Yeah, that's a paradox.
Yeah, it is.
But yeah, I mean, I guess in summary, I would say that I agree with Jung on the idea that there's no point really settling on him until you've tackled the other two. You can certainly go there and sample it and try, because Jungian pathology is present, as we were discussing earlier, in childhood. It can be when we went through the Jung card. We saw how that configures. And it's another way of saying other things. So the Jungian interpretation and the Freudian are only different on the surface because they're part of a bigger field that both can explain in part, but each part is important. The same with Adler, isn't it? So I think that, and I think the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation is such a simple way of addressing this. Like, where are my instincts, my biological instincts? What's happening with my Adler? Am I ready for Jung? And do I cycle back through them? Yes, is the answer to that. You keep at it, because you never get rid of Freud, never. And if we're not careful, we'll see him and we won't see Adler. We'll do what Jung did and say Adler's the other one. Where is he? Can't see him.
Yeah.
And yet that's where normal relating operates, is through Adler. So Adler can satisfy Jung's negative anima for a man, because if you, as a man, constellate the negative anima, you do not have social interest. You have not only ordinary ego self-interest, you're in a very different state. Very, very different. You have a transpersonal injury of representation if it constellates into the representational form of Jung's anima. And within that is nested every other kind of relationship, just taken on that form. So yeah, I agree with Jung in that sense. It's become like a death demon. The same with the animus when it takes that position.
Yeah. But you can get to the positive Jungian anima or animus by developing positive Adler.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, because that's consolidated at that stage.
Yes.
And you've come to terms with Freud and understand how to release him. And what we say, for example, is that the neuropsychoanalysts focus on Panksepp, but they don't on what we call meta-instincts. But Jaak Panksepp himself was hinting at the end of his life that he would have liked to have gone in that direction.
Yeah.
But it's not been taken up. In the same way that the Jungians don't really work with complexes. They talk about them, but they don't work with them. They're seduced by fantasies instead. And we've pushed the idea of meta-instincts being the context that will allow Panksepp to operate properly in the world. Otherwise, Panksepp fires randomly, and then you get what Freud saw. These crazy, unrestrained drives, which have to be neurotically capped. And then you get hysteria, the transduction, which Rossi understands so very well. Yeah, it's a big field, a lot of corners, and best not to stand in them with our face inside the corner. I mean, to turn around and look, oh, there's another corner, and there's someone in it, and it's worth relating to them and understanding. Like we said to Anthony Stevens, and he did appreciate it, that he was the first to plough the furrow and to seed it for us and other people. And he did it. He laid the first furrow. He ploughed it, seeded it, and it should never be forgotten.
No, he was dignified as well.
Very dignified.
Yeah. Very dignified in everything he did.
Yeah. Outstanding. Well, guys, if that's all for today, that's all for today. I'll see you soon. Thank you.